For the purpose of the recording, the motion is that, assuming feasibility, we would base the prescription of pain medicine and anaesthesia on academic studies of pain caused by a condition or procedure rather than an individual patient's perception of pain. I'd like to welcome first. Maya, yeah. Could you speak from here so you're on the laptop? Yes. Thank you.
Because the opioid crisis kills thousands of people every day, destroying hundreds of thousands of families that are ruins of life, hundreds of thousands. This is not caused by teenagers taking ordinary people who have to go to a hospital and get incorrectly overprescribed opioids by their doctors, addicted and have their entire lives destroyed. The team that solves this automatically wins the debate because we save lives and we help. Few things in this speech then. Firstly, on setup, what do we think this looks like? Secondly, on how we're alleviate the opioid crisis, which is our clearest path to victory. And then thirdly, a bit more on why this is prescribing papers. So firstly, on setup, the first thing to say is that academic studies that currently exist, often small, they are sometimes old, and they often do have some systematic errors, and perhaps they didn't include a lot of women in their database. We acknowledge that this is perhaps an issue in the status quo. It's debate issue to be so you actually change the kind of evidence that you're relying on. I think this looks like one of two things. Firstly, these much bigger new studies that obviously acknowledge the issues, the fact that they didn't include them in the studies, and correct that by having a large sample size that is very representative. This is strongly progressive. They realize the issues currently and they want to do like good things with their research. I mean, I think that you're therefore not going to have to over-rely on any research that exists. But secondly, we think that a better option, perhaps you just invent some kind of new machine that maybe even quantifying this, that can like look at your diagnosis painkiller that is. Because like, come on, let's be creative in this debate. Like, there's no reason why that couldn't exist. And perhaps I can even do things like account for individual perceptions of pain. But like either whichever one of those you accept, we think that they're both probably good for us. And the third notice I is just to say that this is obviously something that happens after diagnosis, so when you don't have a diagnosis yet, you can still be given painkillers. The implication here is because this is not something that is feasible in the status quo and we must apply feasibility, I think this debate requires a certain amount of activity. I think we'll get to do things like create a big aggregated database that's better than what exists. So, first is the standard then on how we alleviate the opioid crisis. Just to prove how specifically basing painkillers on perception of pain is one of the mechanisms by which this crisis is perpetuated. Obviously, if we prove this, then this is basically an auto win because it's such a massive issue in the status quo. So, first bit of framing here is to explain why the opioid crisis is happening. That's for a few reasons. That's because corporations have the incentive to sell opioids because they want to make money. They also have the incentive to make these opioids addictive, so they can sell more of them. And note here that opioids are actually not effective pain management long-term, except people end up being prescribed these long-term because of those corporate pressures, because of that marketing. How is this enabled currently by the focus on perception of pain? We have three mechanisms here. Patients have structural incentives to exaggerate their pain. This is not to blame anything on patients. This is just to say that, of course, if you're a patient, you have a short-term incentive, you don't want to be in pain, and you're going to tell your doctor that. But also, notably, with things like withdrawal from opioids, also causes a lot of pain, also causes a lot of side effects. You're also going to prescribe to your doctor, which means that if doctors, when they have the best incentives and when they are listening to you, prescribing more opioids because they want to stop that pain, and you're prescribing to be like quite bad. But secondly, we think that because corporations know that consumers have agency currently, and they can talk to the doctors, this gives them incentives to market their opioids. It's to give them incentives to do things like create predatory ads that say you should buy this thing to solve all your problem, which means the doctor then goes, the patient then goes to a doctor and says, this is going to fix my problem, I need this, and the doctor, especially in countries like America where this advertising is legal, or maybe developing nations as well. I think it's obviously very bad to now patients are pressuring their doctors to comply with these ads. But thirdly, we think there's just a lot of competitive pressures in the private system. That is to say, even if you as a doctor know that opioids is bad and you don't prescribe your patient those opioids, they will simply move to another doctor who, or they will keep on looking for doctors until someone will give them the opioids that they want and someone will listen to what they say about their pain, which means that they're going to get the opioid anyway. So your incentive is now to just give it to them, and at least you can get some money from it because the harm spend is the same either way. This is really bad. What is the kind of action on our side? We think firstly we get rid of the pressure entirely. Everyone's prescribing on the same metrics. There is no places to shop around with doctors. But secondly, we think that, yeah, you get far more uniform prescription. Secondly, we think that corporations, and then the third mechanism here is corporations make drugs more addictive because they want to know if their drug is working, and because patients will say that their drug is working if it's relieving their pain, because they often conflate addiction to a drug with pain relief because they feel like their life was better. But obviously, once you stop, you're in even more pain than originally. Top of your original condition, you have the withdrawal, which contributes to a conception of pain, which makes it even more subjective and unreliable and even harder to get off it. The culmination of this is to prove that patients to the opioid crisis. What are the harms of this? I think it's quite obvious, Annika. When people start taking opioids as painkillers, when they become addicted, even when their doctor stops prescribing them opioids, at the point at which you enter the black market, you buy them illegally, you start drinking heroin, you start injecting them as a faster way to experience that relief, and that happens. And then that is where people overdose, and that is where people die. That is the single biggest harm that any team could ever prove in this debate. But even if it doesn't get that bad, you just have to go through the process of recovering from that addiction. That is horrible. You probably have to lose your job. Your family is probably destroyed. You probably spend lots of money buying these really expensive opioids because you feel that you need them. If we are able to slightly improve this crisis, automatically win this debate. How do we do uniquely stop the opioid crisis? First, we get rid of, I already explained. Secondly, we get rid of pressure from patients on their doctors because every doctor is doing the same thing. Thirdly, we just have way more accountability. That is to say, at the point at which you get addicted and you take the doctor to a tribunal, you can show the chart and say, look, you should not have given me this opioid because that is not what I should have gotten for the condition. And you can tell them they did the wrong thing. When it's based on perception, they can just argue, no, this patient looks like they're in a lot of pain. I had to help them. What are the impacts of this? Firstly, doctors stop prescribing opioids for chronic pain in the first place. Because no here, all the evidence we have currently shows that they do not work for chronic pain, right? The reason the doctors prescribe them is because the patients really tell the truth because they're being convinced by ads that bad. This means people never get addicted in the first place. This is the easy benefit that we get here. But secondly, doctors stop opioid prescription earlier. Instead of giving these patients opioids to take home, they just give them to you in the hospital because they know the pain after surgery is bad. They don't give them to you long term again. Data empirically shows that this is a far better way to use opioids because the issue is currently that even when doctors have good incentives, even when they know that opioids are bad, they simply don't have the capacity to objectively analyze your pain because they have to rely on your perception, and that means they are likely to do things like overprescribe, particularly given corporate pressure and stuff. The way here, the reason why this is not for us to win the debate is just that we save lives. This is so much better than anything that they can claim. We save families. This is the most important material in the debate. But last part of this speech, or second part of this speech, I'm going to talk about why this is a good metric for pain. This is going to prove why perception is inherently harmful. So, first thing to say, so a few reasons why basing prescription over perception is harmful. First thing to say is, as I said before, you have incentives to exaggerate. But secondly, just that perception is very subjective. That is to say, this often looks like a doctor saying regular pain on 1 to 10. Obviously, patients have very different perceptions of pain. Pain before, you're likely to rate yourself much lower than it should be. If you've experienced very serious pain, you're likely to say it's a 7 or 8, when actually maybe you would change your mind later and say it's going to be 3. You literally value for anything from this. This is viable and not a good thing to do. The harm of this is the drugs are allocated incorrectly, which is obviously quite bad. Because firstly, that means if you get not enough drugs because you rate the pain too small, you feel more pain, that's pretty bad. But secondly, if you get too much drugs, you get more side effects, you get the risks that come along with that, also bad. And also to point out here, they might try and tell you that there's small differences between people, how people experience pain, you can't have an objective measure. Because all of it, we would like to point out that things like Panadol still exist. So obviously we have still ways of over-the-counter pain medication that can account for small differences. We don't think you need differences in prescription to account for this. Second part of this point is to explain that necessarily perception of pain is based on the reception of the doctor, in that the doctor must judge your perception of pain and turn that into an allocation and turn that into a prescription that they can give you. This is particularly bad because they're probably going to try and explain to you this is really bad for women because they don't get their pain listed currently, and it's important that we listen to. I'm going to actually flip this harm preemptively and prove why this way worse for women and minorities when you have to base it on perception. That is because now bias gets far worse. That is to say the doctors still don't believe women's perception of pain. They still think that you're exaggerating it. And because they have that subjectivity and you can't prove anything, they're probably just going to rely on that bias and say it anyway.
And so therefore it gets far worse for women. But also we think this just looks like distortions in doctor-patient relationships where they're likely to say, oh, prescribe to patients that they're empathetic towards, like patients that see for a long time. The comparative here is that when they use objective data, we think I've already explained the setup by this data is likely to get better, which means that it probably just won't describe as women. But even if it does, we think even if the data is sometimes skewed, at least we can eliminate the bias from individual doctors because they have to rely on that data. They can't just rely on their preconceptions of pain. So the comparative, and also we know that the incentives are to make these studies way better now, way better for women, solve the overall crisis.
I'd like to thank First Affirmative for that speech. Welcome First Negative.
Oh.
Oh no, I'm charging my phone. Oh.
Database that you are
in the problem. Corporation was rapid offering. Over drug addiction problem, still filling of how much drug you can give to a person, not an unlimited fiat. Go to the second layer. What exactly is conveyed in this aspect? It's a subjective experience. Academic studies. Oh, what is I choose to of yours, like the patient's subjective pain, exactly the same mechanism that they feel like it's not justifiable, it's irrational. More generically used on animals. I would say lots of female, lots of like more generalized in one situation. Overly generalized database of using it cannot be applied into doctors highly religious standards and the previous of how people they are. To look at and what kind of like studies you're focusing on, we're saying the current studies do like black minority and like with visible disease, which means that they give more financial assistance and more like more medical research to these areas. For example, chronic pain, chronic bowel pain, instead of like studying period pain. Even though they have the fear to say that there will be existing medical studies, however, they don't have the fear to say these kind of studies are completely going to be transparent and absolutely correct. This is the fear called unsatisfactory and signify they ensure that this will be implemented in a completely accurate and 100% way, because that's the space for set negative to tell you why these current academic studies cannot be implemented into medical like prescription to actually solve the problems of these minorities. So now have better prescription. I think individuals have different perception of what exactly they're suffering, and they have different perceptions of pain. And we want this is your bodily autonomy to choose how you're dealing with your pain. Like you want to tolerate it, or you want to like actively like use medicine and rely on medicine to solve it. And second of all, they're talking about how there will be pressure from pain because like patients already have the inherent incentive to exaggerate the pain. We see this is factually untrue for females. That is also the reason why lots of pain currently done, current academic studies of like pain is not so like in favor of women bodies, because we're saying the lots of reason why females currently die more in car accidents and car crash, because lots of studies done on the like blood level control after you go into like the ICU and go into the medical studies of male instead of comparatively speaking to female, which is done like decades ago. So we're saying this time lag and the incapability of like having a better sample size will actually be inefficient to give the accurate and more suitable transcription to these women on the ground. And second of all, we just see that you have different pain varies on different individuals. And fifth of all, we are seeing the current impact of how there is a 7 years of lack of diagnosis regarding the scope of, for example, period pain or like postpartum pain, because when you are reporting to the doctors as you're having a period pain, they automatically categorize and fall into a certain category instead of like actually listening to you and instead of actually like considering what source of pain you're undergo. So there's the impact of lagging of research because you don't have the incentive to research on this very nuanced and niche market. And sixth of all, we say because the current sample size is so biased, it's very unlikely to increase the representation of minority in these scenarios. So now let's talk about why we will have better medical development overall. So firstly, doctors will simply listen to you more than like not listening. We want to deal with the clash of discretionary power, and better this flexibility will be beneficial for these minorities. We say it's absolutely going to be more beneficial. Why? Because
under their side, when like you enter a hospital, especially in third world developing country, where there like is a limited healthcare resources, what doctors is more likely to do is that they have like a lazy inclination to have the over reliance on, like, for example, I have like A, B, C, D, E standards. I can just like arbitrarily categorize their pain into certain standards and they give them the certain prescriptions. However, the comparative on our side is that even though you have implicit bias towards Black minority, but you are structurally, you have to listen to them. You like necessarily have a more lengthy process and more lengthy therapeutic process because you have to listen to their individual reflections on the pain. What does it mean? Hey, you're less likely to impose your implicit bias on them because you cannot say, because I feel like Black minority has like a low pain tolerance, so I'm like unlikely to listen to their advocacy. Signify by increasing the lengthy process of you are actually listening to their ideas and opinions, you're more likely to have sympathy with them, even though you're like such a racist. But listening to them complaining like 10 minutes of how painful they are, like actually explicitly express their feelings towards like period pain or like postpartum pain, you're much more likely to be compassionate with this patient. With this is a huge benefit the set affirmative will never get to you. What does it link further? It means that after this kind of like pain recipients and after this kind of like clinical process, these like symptoms and these diagnoses are also likely to feed back into the current academic studies to develop a faster process of actually including more sample base and actually include more focus on the niche market of like lots of minority on the ground. So finally, we want to talk about when you are making this kind of lengthy process, you're now in a huge run. And secondarily, you know, doctors are being more patient and they're more empathetic, etc. They're actually having a deliberate consideration. Throw you into the category of painkillers and never have the possibility to open up their access to like actually listen to what you're thinking. So at the end of the speech, what do you know? You know that on their side, they don't have the fear to say like all academic studies will be completely good. We're saying the current are on a very biased sample place, and they have no feasibility and no possibility because on our side, what we tell you is that we offer a unique incentive for doctors to incline on a more humanistic approach when they're in the clinical process, instead of rigidly and like categorize people into some certain categories. And thirdly, we tell you how opium crisis is symmetric and only works on their side. So for all this reason, I've never bothered to oppose.
I'd like to thank the first negative for that speech. Welcome the second affirmative to respond. Here.
I do volunteering with St. John Ambulance, and with your option to provide methoxyflurane, which is like the green whistle for pain relief. but we don't just give it based on a patient's perception of pain. If they say, oh, I'm super in pain, because we take into account the injury and what's actually occurring to the patient. So if a patient has a terrible headache, we're not just going to be giving them the green whistle, because that's not the thing that will actually help them. And so what we actually do is we know what works to help this condition, and we do what actually works to help this condition. So in the case of a headache, we're likely to give paracetamol or an ice pack. And the reason why is that the mechanism of pain depends on the condition in which you're facing. People face different pain for different conditions. And so when you can target that mechanism, because you've studied that mechanism in academia, that's what you know how pain helps that means then you can reduce that, you can help them. So for example, if you have an eye to reduce swelling, use an ice pack. You don't just give someone any form of pain relief. But when someone has a fractured arm, you don't give them an ice pack because that hurts them. Use the idea of condition. So yes, there are certain medications that block pain, but Mary explained those are ultimately bad. 3 questions. Firstly, a defense on the opioid crisis. Secondly, a question on how effective academia is. And then thirdly, a question on patients. So firstly, a question on the opioid crisis. They try to claim that the opioid crisis regulations. They don't respond to Mayer's regulation. The Mayer explains that the most powerful tool of the opioid crisis is that doctors have discretion for specifically the pressure from patients, because they can either go elsewhere in order to get their medication. There's a competitive incentive, both dual in terms of like you can earn money from your patient, and they'll probably just get this medication from elsewhere. But secondly, corporations have incentive to advertise to individuals to say, this will best help your back pain. So you should ask your doctor to do that. This will best help your pain. So you should put pressure on your doctor to get this medication, where you probably don't need this. This was the especially pernicious thing that we thought was best solved when you gave doctors discretion, and you said, well, if they're facing back pain, here's a chart of medication that you have to give in this situation. You give one of those, and that's what we think that was regression that it is. So let's think that we think that lab material, or can you value that quite highly, because even on the set of times where people experience a bit more pain because we don't get them as much medication, under our side, people are dying. And this is occurring on a much greater scale. Monies of the wallets are being drained due to addiction. And so we thought on the scale of harm, both on individuals and to society, that was one you should weigh much higher. So, question on academia. They kind of assert that academia will do this quite badly. Let's go through, firstly, there are, I guess, a set of 5 reasons to why academia is pretty good at doing this. Firstly, in order to do research, you have to get grant fundings from the government. And so and oftentimes to get more money, you need to be more applicable. To be more competitive, you need to be more applicable. So that means then capturing more groups of people in your study. And so then you have an incentive in order to get your grant to ensure that you're being as representative of society, so the government can justify giving you that money. Or on the commercial side of research, you have an incentive commercially such that your medication can either be more competitive because it's more effective to women, or you can be more competitive by entering a new market in period pain. So we thought that that incentives exist to sort of that study well. Secondly, the own prestige of academics who were studying had incentives in order to make sure that they were studying well. Because if they had a broader and better study, that means they were able to get more citations in their paper. That meant that they're able to ask their university for higher promotions or higher pay because they were being a more effective researcher. Or if you're in a corporation, you can ask for more pay because you just develop something that's more effective. And so then that means then, but on the comparative, if you have a bad study that's called out for being racist, that's called out for lacking certain areas, you could lose your job, you can be fired, you can lose your potential PhD like Jan Hunchik-Schraan did. So that meant that you had an incentive to make sure you had good studies. Third thing to say is that the ethics committees in approving your study. And so that is to ensure that your study is representative, because a university or your corporation doesn't want to eat the cost of having a bad study that's racist or unrepresentative. They want to make sure that you're taking into account everyone, because there's a reputation hit if you post a bad study. The fourth thing to say is that there exists a peer review process when you do submit your papers and do your study. That is to say, when you submit to a journal, they want the best papers because that means they can get more attention and more subscriptions. So they have incentive to vet out pretty bad papers that don't take women into account, that don't take minorities into account. They'll prefer papers that do, because that means they get more attention, more of it that builds prestige for them. They can get more money from that. But also they look bad if they platform bad papers. The fifth and final thing to say here is that academia is likely to be more progressive because they know of these issues. These individuals are highly educated. We also know there's a lot of critique of the previous and it's reported. The counterfactual and ultimately why we're so much better on the comparative were twofold reasons. Firstly, our scale and the scale of our publications and when you did this research, we got a lot of people and studying all their pain too, and so we got a pretty good aggregate of what pain looked like for individuals. So that meant then when a doctor referred to these academia studies, they could do so in a pretty good way. But secondly, What happens under outside is that we study the mechanisms of pain. So we're best able to understand how to give medication that best treats the pain you are facing. So the comparative under their side is that what happens is that they just kind of defer to how much the patient's feeling. They give something more powerful that either hurts them, gets them addictive, or the problems that take into account. There are a couple of claims to this. They say there's a time lag. Firstly, we have to, like the topic does say, assume feasibility. But secondly, there are incentives to ensure that you push this stuff out. Well, get it out. But thirdly, there's a time lag in the short term, which is then the prescription of pain is perhaps symmetric. But then we're better in the long term and willing to trade off that long-term trade for the reasons that we explained. Well, yeah. They initially claim that, for example, they claim that, for example, females don't exaggerate, they will have a bad representation to say females won't be exaggerating pain. But this is a weird concession because under their side, when the female goes to the doctor, they under-exaggerate their pain. That means then they get lower amounts of medication, worse pain medication. They are more in pain. On that outside, they get the right pain medication for themselves. So we thought in counterfactual, they get the right pain drugs. And so, yeah. And then, And then the whole deal with that explains why academia is going to be pretty good, but we also get better information on how pain occurs. So that means you will actually better able to treat pain, which works in a non-addictive way. The second, so let's move on to the third issue about how there's people who experience pain in a somewhat subjective way, and how, So the first claim that they make, well, the stronger claim is that they say that you're now forced to listen to a patient under their side. However, what we argue to you is that doctors are already empathetic and do it pretty well under our side. But secondly, we argue to that they better listen to others with years of experience. So they can focus on the emotional impacts of the patient rather than the pain impacts under our side. When they're just given, they're told what the pain is, they can deal with the pain, don't have to worry about that. They can focus on emotional impacts under our side. But also, thirdly, they must listen to the diagnosis. And then fourthly, we argue also on the comparative, they feel like that if they believe that patients are likely to over-exaggerate pain, that means that they're likely going to dismiss them more under our side. We have an accountability metric for doctors under our side, which is so important, because when someone came in with a condition, there was a set of things which they had to prescribe. So if they went above that and they prescribed something that was harmful, then they can be questioned on why did you not listen to the studies? And if they went below that, they could also be questioned on that. We get to ensure that what is ultimately best for the patient. The other claim is that there's a set of people who experience a lot of pain. The things to say to this is, firstly, if you experience more pain because it's linked to a condition, that something might be chronic, then you can be that can be taken into account, diagnosed, and pain can be given to help that. Secondly, if we can give medication that sufficiently helps your pain, then the experience of less pain is a win for us. Maybe you still have some pain because you experience more pain under their side, but we'll find because they don't get addicted. We'll find because the entire goal is to reduce pain feeling. The third thing to say is there's probably going to be a pretty small group of people that are willing to trade off for all our other mechanisms. Now, fourthly, if you believe none of that, I think if there are people who experience great pain no matter what we do, they're probably going to experience terrible pain under their side when you prescribe them medication, and so there's no benefit, there's no change. For example, my uncle experienced chronic pain, nothing was able to help him, and as a result,
I'd like to thank second affirmative for that speech. Welcome second negative.
When there is a norm that pain is completely subjective and can vary to great degrees, that is when that woman who is experiencing particularly large period pain is never diagnosed with endometriosis, or however you pronounce it, or any of the intersecting chronic conditions that could possibly hurt her, because that doctor perceives that this could just be very severe period pain. Only on our side, when doctors understand that there's very small variations of pain, and most people experience period pain should exist between 6.5 and 7.5 of this particular scale. But then that patient is on the floor right. That is when they refer them to an ultrasound. That is the benefit that we get under our side, because only on our side, when you actually have good objective understandings of pain, can doctors make well-informed decisions. Their decisions are not well-informed. It's based on like a teaspoon of patient subjectivity, with a dash of doctor reception, with a whole bucket load of corporate influence. And that was never a good basis to make decisions on. 3 issues in the speech. Firstly, how we alleviate opioid crises. Secondly, on academic studies. Lastly, variations. Firstly, on the most important issue of alleviating opioid crisis. Why is this the most important issue? It is by far the most concrete impact in this debate. And that is because when people are addicted to opioids, they go broke from buying prescriptions. They become addicted. They get crippled by side effects. That means that leads to things like liver failure, organ failure, leads to them overdosing or going to the black market. At best, the harm that they encapsulate is incredibly speculative, because we actually don't know whether pain is like a thing that is common with everyone or has variations at all. It's a very unsettled academic question. It's unclear how we quantify that harm. Given this, how do we win this issue? We explain that the most common reasons of why opioid crisis happens is because of the competitive incentives of doctors to alleviate the pain of individual patients and that collective action problem that occurs, right? The way that they try to respond to this is they just scapegoat this by saying, well, no, there are these other bigger reasons that cause opioid crisis. But let's actually look at those reasons. The first reason is that there is a loose regulation. You have to ask yourself, why is there loose regulation? Why can't we make the regulation tighter? The reason why the regulation is loose is because when your whole metric is based on the subjectivity of someone's pain, it's hard to have very strict objective regulation, because a doctor can just be like, well, this person looks like they were suffering. It would have been a breach of my duty or my Hippocratic oath to just let them suffer and writhe on the floor. You cannot do that when on our side, you have a chart that says, well, for these conditions, this is an acceptable range of medicines you can use. If you go outside that acceptable range, that is clearly a breach of your negligent duties, right? The second scapegoat reason is, well, there is lobbying. We explained that the mechanism of lobbying is when patients have agencies and influence over what medicines that doctors prescribe. When doctors listen to their patients and prescribe what their patient tells them to prescribe based on their account of their pain. And that's really, really bad, because the mechanism for lobbying is literally empowered by the fact that patients have a disproportionate amount of agency over their doctor's condition, which means that their scapegoated reasons are literally our mechanism of why the opioid crisis happened. Literally explains the key reason why in the first place is for the reason that they have that ability to influence their doctor disproportionately. I think on that we take a very big win. But secondly, in terms of academic studies, let's deal with their win condition about how studies are biased and poor. The first thing we explain is that because this is an assuming feasibility debate, we do have a degree of fiat that can cancel out the worst instances of things like the rats examples that they talk about. And the reason why you have to believe this is because right now in the status quo, there's very few studies done on like what postpartum pain is like or what period pain is like, which means that currently it is infeasible for a doctor to prescribe medicine on that pain because they do not know what that pain looks like, which means you have to believe that this is a world where studies have been done on period pain. Maybe they aren't perfect, but those studies exist and account for women. But secondly, we explain a number of reasons why studies have done well. Notice a lot of the examples are pretty outdated. Like it's about like 60s doctors doing dumb shit like, you know, prescribing anthrax to African Americans for the reason that they have like bad scientific method. This is a bad understanding of the field of science. And Gus gives a number of mechanisms that are unresponded to about how left-wing academia in like progressive campuses are usually good at accounting for these things. The fact that they have peer review, the fact that there are government incentives to cater for the 50% of the population of women that probably are an important stakeholder within this debate. But lastly, even if these studies weren't perfect, right? These studies are accountable, because if these studies are wrong and they are fundamentally, say, systematically sexist, when you see that, for example, on large aggregated surveys of patient satisfaction surveys, women overwhelmingly are like, my doctor was shitter compared to men. That is something that is easily identifiable and easy to solve way into the future. The problem on their side is when a doctor is systematically biased or sexist in their reception of the bias of pain, they cannot identify that because that doctor does not internalize that they're doing something sexist. They just think every patient is an individual with a different degree of pain, and I just did what was good for that patient, which means in the case where both sides have a degree of bias or sexism, our side is better able to account for that way into the future. Their response is, well, there is a massive variation of pain between people. Most people have small variations of pain. And the reason why we know this is because most people, if you ask them to rank like 10 different painful experiences, they would have like very similar ranks. Like most people, other than maybe Beach, would agree that being is a far worse pain than like getting kicked in the balls, right? Like most people agree that. So that means in small variations of pain, this doesn't really matter. Maybe this matters in big variations of pain, but big variations of pain don't happen by accident. They happen for reasons that this person maybe has had a surgery before or has some kind of chronic condition. But those are things are objective and quantifiable that can be internalized and accounted for by our studies, which means, as I explained in my introduction, the period pain woman is someone that is likely to be covered there. The only other response is, well, big corporations conduct these studies. This is a misallocation of like who actually conducts these studies for what. Big pharma conducts medical studies to sell medicine. That is different to governments funding research for doctors who they fund in order to have better diagnoses. That is a completely different actor on a completely different plane. Then lastly, they say doctors choose different studies. This just symmetricizes the debate at best. Comparatively, note under their side, they don't get an accurate pinpoint of all the pain. They just have people being subjective about their pain, reasons that they never ever respond to. Third issue, how do we deal with variations? They say doctors listen to patients more. Obviously, doctors still listen to patients. Like we don't defend like doctors just being robots or something, but the conversation is far more productive. It's less about complaining about the pain, focusing on how they can recover and all that kind of stuff. And importantly, listening is something that is really, really bad because we explain people cannot accurately capture their pain because sympathy is conflated with pain. Like a family doctor who cares about a family that they're caring for, right, might make a stronger decision to prescribe a greater painkiller because they feel greater sympathy for that child, but that's not a medically correct decision. That is the same in terms of pain conflation. For example, when people are hooked onto opioids and then the doctors try to wean them off, they experience withdrawal symptoms. And those withdrawal symptoms get conflated with their experience of pain. It means that doctors are now unable to wean them off those opioids because these people say, I'm suffering more pain unless you give me those very addictive opioids. I think at the end of the day, you just have to do a numerical breakdown of the scale. Because at worst, if you look at the bell curve, maybe we don't cover the 10% of outliers under their side that experience a lot more pain than doctors and these studies account for. But the problem is on their side, when it's subjected to corporate pressure, the majority of people now fall outside of that acceptable thing. Lastly, in terms of the black market, people go to the black markets when they're irrational. That rationality happens on our side because people are prescribed opioids and then become addicted to them. They are irrational at the point of diagnosis. So ignore that point too. For these reasons, very proud to propose.
Going through childbirth is incredibly painful. And unlike what side affirmative tries to tell you, it does not exist within a certain threshold of pain. If you are giving birth and your doctor is not giving you sufficient medication when you're screaming out in fucking pain that you are literally about to like way too much for you, you probably just don't like a world in which you're forced to go through it. We also know this exists in the flip side. Some people want to go through childbirth and want to not have anaesthesia. That is also a valid thing they want to do. That was a part of their autonomy they also stole. Noting, if there is a medical system that ignores someone, a woman screaming out in pain during childbirth, as we told you at Neva, there are infinite reasons why you just distrust the mainstream medical system. The reason that you give birth at home when there is no doctor around you in the first place. The reason why you go to alternative treatments, that you resort to harder and unregulated drugs. It was on those two grounds that side negative wins this debate. Because not only do we better prescribe to increase the direct quality of life to people who are going through the medical system, but additionally, that we stop people getting so disillusioned with a system that does not listen to them, they resort to worse alternatives. I'm going to do three things in this speech. Firstly is clarifying and set up what this feasibility question really means. Second of all, I'm going to deal in a metric about direct benefit, and third of all, about the broader medical system. Question of feasibility. This debate says assuming feasibility, as in when there is a choice between someone referring to a study or referring to a person, they will refer to the study. To the extent to which you believe they have some fiat to assume they get better, it was unclear why they were going to get better in ways that were totally different to the way they've been improving at the moment. That is to say, tests on animals exist now and have always existed. Tests which resolve measure pain based on rank your pain from 1 to 10 don't have any commentary because that doesn't work with our data profile, is the way that these studies tend to work, and therefore is the way that if they get better, will continue to work in that sense. Also, the third affirmative says things like pain are unsettled academic questions, and we don't even know some of the metrics some of the time. Probably a reason why all of these flattening things are likely to be particularly bad. So, on the first question, as to why in the direct one-on-one interaction that someone has with a medical system is likely to be far worse in a world in which they are not listened to. That is to say, first of all, I'm going to deal with the question about private studies, which is highly connected to the opioid crisis push we tried to get. We would say that private studies are a massive way the medical system works. Unlike the assertion that side affirmative makes, we tell you this is probably for incredibly clear reasons, like you can get more continued backing, and it's also particularly lucrative compared to, as they try and characterize, government grants being really hard to do when you have to keep on doing this kind of market to achieve them. That means that private studies are likely to be very good. We see this empirically. We see the way that Coca-Cola, big oil companies tend to do things like have these studies in the first place. And notably, the only response here is to say that liability is the question. First of all, it was unclear who was doing this liability if these corporations did have massive lobbying powers. And second of all, to the extent to which you can be liable, often these things are just obfuscating the truth rather than just giving a direct data problem. That was incredibly important because if you're doing a study and the female results just don't quite work for you, you can dismiss the female results. The study set that you're still looking at is the same data set. It is just obfuscating the harm that we are likely to accrue. Noting here that unlike what side affirmative tries to say, the reasons why opioids were prescribed and on the market was research which said that they were a good drug, research said that we should send them out, and to find in which cases to use them. So, presumably, if they had so many qualms with the system in the first place, it was likely that it was likely to continue. To the extent which we argue that big corporations with these massive incentives are able to, in some ways, swing these, you don't have to believe it to the same extent that exist uni studies or more verifiable studies. That is to say, if there is one study on the market, it's unclear why the doctor can't just refer to that one. Also, if it's likely to have the most funding, it's likely to be the biggest one. And that means that if there's a massive study from an opioid-backed company which says you should use mega amounts of opioid, it's likely it's going to have a blanket approach on far more people rather than a world in which individuals just have to push for them themselves. That means the systematic oversupply of opioids under this, which is likely to magnify the harm. So at best, at worst, that means that's symmetric. At best, it's another win to side negative. Second of all, dealing with the question of university studies, they say, this is taking the case that these are verifiable studies, they're good, and they're using the most up-to-date science. Number of systematic reasons why even at their best, they're likely to fail. First of all, they incredibly blanket. We get the own analysis of this by side affirmative, who suggests that you need to be able to have a really big audience. You have to be able to get government grants, so the government has to believe it's important. So it's unclear why you're going to get niche studies. So, for example, studies large amount of studies that are focusing on trans issues or trans healthcare when they are very small subsets of the population. We would also note that you cannot mean that studies are going to have intersections of medical history, which is likely to be incredibly important. We also say that animal testing and things are likely to continue to exist. Noting thirdly, on the question of bias, it was far more likely for bias to be far more harmful in a world in which it was given a number and you cannot leave from that number. That is to say, if women are more likely if you rank their pain on a scale of 1 to 10 as lower during because they have to go through more painful things like periods and childbirth, there is no explanation of that. There is no reasoning of that. There is no one to say it is less painful for me, but I still need Panadol. That meant that the ranking that was likely to be implemented on their side is likely to mean that the degree of flexibility that could enable, in some cases, doctors to act better to be listened to. What you have to believe is that under their side, in order to get the same harm, that is to say, women and people of color disproportionately lowering their threshold of pain and therefore being prescribed fully on account of it, that every single doctor would just not listen to somebody begging on the ground. That is to say, doctor interactions are one-on-one, they're far more personal, they're far more intimate. That means it's far harder to actively tell someone, no, I'm not going to do this, and fully just continue your racism to the point of someone screaming out in pain, versus just saying, hey, I've got a number, I have to follow this, there is nothing I can do for you. That was incredibly damaging. That meant the impact on this group were likely to be particularly bad. Harms of this are not only in regards of maybe you're just given the wrong amount of pain medication, maybe it's too much, maybe it's too less. Notably also you have your autonomy entirely stripped in the process of whether that was right or not. Maybe you didn't want to take a certain drug because you didn't feel like you wanted to. Maybe you wanted to experience a pain and you didn't like relying on drugs. These were all situations in which autonomy was incredibly useful. Now on to the other way that side negative wins this debate. That is to say, a medical culture which explicitly says we will not listen to you no matter what you say is one where nobody will buy into it. We tell you this never entirely unresponded to. We say, first of all, if you don't feel like you're going to access it, doctors are probably worse at doing it for conditions, even when that is probably under analysis in the first place. They're likely to stop valuing your opinion altogether. That means it's harder to do things like diagnosis when it comes to more smaller scale differences in pain. Second of all, alternative treatments are likely to pop up in the absence of that because a lot of people would just be unable to trust that system, which has absolutely no flexibility. That was likely to be better. And third of all, the entire medical system slows down because, as we tell you, it has to be verified for each case by case. What do you know at the end of the speech? The way the side affirmative tries to win is on a question of the opioid crisis. We tell you, not at least it's symmetrical, but additionally, they're likely to lose it because these medical corporations have so much power in the first place, and to the extent to which some will continue to resist, the opioid crisis is going to continue to get worse. But even if you don't believe that, a medical system which has no faith in the people and does not listen to their needs as they go is a medical system which not only denies them absolute any semblance of bodily autonomy to do what they want with themselves, but also means that they're experiencing pain where they don't need to. And pain, even if they try and say it's on a small scale, can do things like prompt people to have incredibly poor mental health, can mean that their lived quality of life was worse, and can mean that their lives are in danger. That was incredibly damning. Side negative wins this debate, not only on trust in the system, but on making that system actively better. Never been prouder to negate.
Speech with please take the floor.